February 25, 2005, 6:17 a.m. Wichita, Kansas. A man in a gray Cherokee pulls slowly onto 67th Street North, on his way to church. The same church, every Sunday, for 30 years. He never arrives. Police cars close from both directions, simultaneously. 8 months earlier, this man had sent investigators a floppy disk. He asked them one question: "Can you trace a disk back to its source?" They told him no. They were lying. The disk's metadata listed one word: Dennis, linked to a church in Wichita. 31 years, 10 murders, 1 church deacon. The only reason we know his name is because he needed us to know it. This video is about that need, because that need is the most disturbing thing in this story. Not the crimes, the psychology that made him send the disk. Dennis Rader's neighbors described him as a little difficult. His church described him as devoted. His co-workers in code enforcement described him as thorough, maybe too thorough, but reliable. His children grew up in a normal house in a normal suburb. He attended church every Sunday. He coached. He volunteered. He complained about his neighbors' dogs. Between 1974 and 1991, he murdered 10 people. Not all at once, not in a frenzy. Carefully, deliberately. And then he went home. January 15, 1974. The Otero family, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, were killed in their home. Charlie Otero, the older son, came home from school to find them. Rader continued killing through the 70s and 80s. Then in 1991, he stopped. No arrest, no death, no obvious reason. He simply went quiet. For 13 years, BTK disappeared. Wichita began to wonder if he was dead. He wasn't. He was at church. Here's the thing that forensic psychologists point to when they study this case. Rader's ability to maintain a complete double life for over 30 years isn't explained by intelligence alone. It requires something more specific in the brain. The capacity to fully compartmentalize, to switch between two identities with no emotional cross-contamination. The research on this goes back to Robert Hare's work on psychopathy at UBC in the 1980s. And what Hare found changes how we understand cases like this entirely. Robert Hare developed the psychopathy checklist, the standard diagnostic tool still used in forensic settings today. One of its core findings: psychopathic individuals don't experience emotions the way most people do, but they learn to perform them perfectly. Not because they feel remorse, fear, or connection, but because they observe what those responses look like and mirror them back. This is what criminologists call the mask of sanity, a term coined by psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley in 1941 and still cited in forensic literature today. Rader wore the mask continuously for 3 decades. His church saw his Sunday face, his family saw his father face, and somewhere, locked in a storage unit he kept separate from both, was everything else. Brain imaging studies on psychopathic individuals show reduced activity in the amygdala, the region associated with fear, empathy, and emotional response. But here's what makes it more complex. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, impulse control, and social performance, in many psychopathic individuals shows normal or even above normal function. What you get is someone who can plan carefully, perform socially, and feel very little conflict about the gap between the two. This isn't someone who loses control. This is someone with exceptional control, just no emotional governor on how they use it. Rader himself described his internal world in his police confession, a confession that lasted hours and that investigators described as one of the most methodical they had ever heard. He spoke about his victims clinically. He described his planning without visible distress. And when asked how he managed to maintain a normal family life while doing what he did, he said he simply kept them separate. 2 worlds, no bridge between them. That level of internal architecture takes something most people don't have, and it still doesn't explain the floppy disk. For that, we need to talk about what was driving him underneath all of it. Between 1974 and 1979, BTK sent 7 communications to police and local media. He described his crimes in detail. He gave himself the name BTK. He sent letters, he sent poems, he sent trophies. FBI behavioral analysts classify this pattern as injecting, the killer actively inserting himself into the investigation. It's rare, but when it happens, it tells investigators something specific about the individual's psychology. They don't just want to kill, they want to be known for it. FBI research from the Behavioral Science Unit identifies a consistent pattern among communicating killers. The communications are not about taunting police, they're about audience. The killer has constructed a self-concept, a narrative about who they are, that requires external witnesses to feel real. In psychological terms, this is called narcissistic supply, the validation, attention, and recognition that a narcissistic individual needs to sustain their sense of self. For Rader, the crimes alone weren't enough. Someone had to know. Someone had to acknowledge that BTK existed. Then he stopped communicating. 1979 to 1991. He continued killing but went silent publicly. 1991, last murder, and then nothing. For 13 years, investigators believed he had died, moved, or was incarcerated for something else. The reality: Rader was still in Wichita, still at church, still checking compliance violations. Psychologists who reviewed the case suggest the 13 years may have been a period of relative stability, a leadership role, a promotion, enough external validation to quiet the need for BTK to be seen. But validation from church and work has a ceiling, and in 2004, that ceiling became visible. In 2004, a book was published about the BTK case. Rader read it. His response, as he later described it, was that it got the story wrong. Not that he was mentioned, not that he was exposed, it got his story wrong. From a clinical standpoint, this is a textbook narcissistic injury, a perceived threat to the self-concept. For someone whose entire internal narrative was built around being BTK, having that narrative told inaccurately by someone else was intolerable. He had to correct the record. Here is a man who had successfully evaded capture for 30 years, who understood forensic evidence well enough to avoid leaving traceable DNA, who had spent decades carefully maintaining his mask. His survival instinct was demonstrably high. And yet, when the choice was remain unknown and safe, or be seen and risk everything, the narcissism won. Psychologist Reid Malloy describes this as the fundamental contradiction of the grandiose psychopath. The self-concept they protect ultimately becomes the mechanism of their own destruction. Rader spent months communicating again in 2004 and 2005. Letters, packages, a cereal box, a doll staged to reference one of his crimes, and then the disc. He genuinely believed he was operating in a different technological era than he was. He believed a floppy disk could not be traced. He asked. They lied. He sent it. The metadata on the disk contained a name, Dennis, and a link to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. From there, it took investigators less than 48 hours, 31 years, ended by a floppy disk and the need to be seen. BTK's case is studied in forensic psychology courses because it sits at the intersection of three well-documented psychological constructs: psychopathy, the reduced emotional response and high behavioral control; narcissistic personality structure, the need for external validation as a core survival drive; and what researchers call the fantasy cycle, a pattern where the gap between internal fantasy and external reality becomes intolerable without action. These three together are not unique to serial killers. They appear, in less extreme forms, across high-control individuals who eventually self-destruct in ways that seem to defy their own intelligence. The reason forensic psychologists study cases like BTK isn't to understand murderers. It's to understand the underlying psychological architecture that makes someone simultaneously highly functional and catastrophically self-undermining. The mask is real. The compartmentalization is real. The narcissistic need for recognition is real. And the floppy disk is what happens when those systems reach a breaking point. Whether the context is a serial killer, a corporate executive who destroys their career for a moment of ego, or a politician who lies when the truth would have saved them, The psychology is the same. Could Dennis Rader have been stopped earlier? The hard answer: possibly. His first communication in 1974 contained identifiable psychological markers. But the tools to act on those markers were still being developed at that time. By the time the FBI's behavioral science unit had enough operational infrastructure, Rader had already stopped. The irony of the case: he wasn't caught by better tools or smarter investigators. He was caught by his own psychology. The same force that drove the crimes ended them. Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences in 2005. Under Kansas law, he is not eligible for parole. He has given numerous interviews from prison. He continues to speak about his crimes in detail. Every interview is, in some sense, the floppy disk again. The need to be seen doesn't turn off with a prison sentence. That's what makes this case a lens, not just on one man, but on a specific type of psychology that shows up, in different forms, across different contexts. Once you understand what was actually driving BTK, you'll start recognizing the pattern in places you didn't expect. If you want to follow that thread, the psychology of why intelligent people self-destruct to be seen, the next video on your screen now goes deeper into exactly that. And if this kind of psychological breakdown is what you're here for, subscribe. New videos on criminal psychology every week.